Elara Vance decided to bake a pie on a Tuesday in late October. The decision was not born of charity, though that was the excuse she would give herself, a small, necessary lie to hold against the encroaching silence. The truth was that the house had become too quiet, a stillness so profound it felt like a physical weight on her chest. Her late husband, Daniel, had been a man of booming laughter and heavy footsteps, a presence that had filled every corner of their small farmhouse until it had seemed the very walls were built around the shape of his voice. In the 2 years since the fever had taken him, the silence he left behind had grown, metastasizing from a simple absence of sound into a living entity. It sat with her at the dinner table. It lay beside her in the cold expanse of their bed. Loneliness, she had discovered, was not an emptiness. It was a presence. She stood in her kitchen, the morning light a pale, dusty yellow slicing through the window, and looked at her own reflection in the dark glass. She saw a woman who had become indistinct, even to herself. Wide-hipped, heavy-shouldered, built for work and for comfort, not for turning heads. Her hair, the color of dried straw, was pinned in a severe bun at the nape of her neck. Her face was plain, pleasant enough, but lacking any feature that might snag a person's memory. She had made a promise to the woman in the glass, a covenant forged in the raw, early days of grief. She would not be vulnerable again. She would not love again. She would not hand the keys to her own peace over to another person, only to have them snatched away by fate or fever. She had built a fortress of routine and quiet resignation, and for 2 years it had held. But on this particular Tuesday, a crack had appeared in the fortifications. The autumn air was too crisp, the turning leaves too painfully beautiful. The silence in the house was too loud. Despair was a cold draft seeping under the door, and she needed to build a fire against it. Baking was a kind of fire. It was creation. It was work for her hands, a task with a clear beginning and a satisfying end. So a pie. An apple pie for the new man who had moved into the old Miller cabin down the road a fortnight ago. A gesture of welcome, a neighborly duty. That was the lie she needed, the one that allowed her to act without admitting the deeper truth. She was baking a pie to save herself from drowning in the quiet of her own life. Section. She worked with a familiar, methodical grace. Her hands, chapped and strong from hauling water and tending her garden, were surprisingly deft with the pastry. She sifted the flour, a fine white cloud rising in the slanted sunlight. The scent of it, clean and earthy, was the first real thing she had smelled all morning. She cut in the lard with 2 knives, the metallic flick-flick-flick a welcome percussion against the silence. She remembered her mother teaching her this, the secret to a flaky crust lying in the coldness of the ingredients and the quickness of the hand. Don't overwork it, Elara. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, a ghost of a sound. Let it be what it is. She had tried to apply that lesson to her life, to let her grief be what it was, but she had overworked it, kneading it, and turning it until it had become a tough, dense thing inside her. The dough for the pie, however, she could control. She added the ice water a tablespoon at a time, mixing it gently with a fork until the mixture just came together. She gathered it into a ball, flattened it into a disc, and wrapped it in waxed paper to chill. An act of patience, a small, manageable piece of the world she could command. The apples were from the gnarled tree at the edge of her property, a tree Daniel had planted the year they were married. They were tart, green-skinned, and stubbornly imperfect. She peeled them in a long, continuous spiral, the sharp blade of her paring knife whispering against the fruit. She cored and sliced them, the pieces falling into a large ceramic bowl with a soft thud. Cinnamon, nutmeg, a pinch of allspice, a squeeze of lemon. The smells were warm, autumnal, the very essence of harvest and home. They were smells from a life she used to have. The thought came unbidden, sharp as a shard of glass. She pushed it away, focusing on the task. Stir. Coat the apples. Taste a slice to check the spice. It was a ritual, a spell against memory. She rolled out the chilled dough on the floured countertop, the wooden rolling pin a familiar weight in her hands. The circle was not perfect, but it was close enough. She fitted it into the pie plate, the excess dough slumping over the sides. She poured the spiced apples into the shell, mounding them high in the center. The second disc of dough became the top crust. She crimped the edges with her thumb and forefinger, sealing the sweet promise within. A few slashes with a knife to let the steam escape. A wash of milk to ensure a golden brown finish. As she slid the pie into the hot oven, the warmth that bloomed against her face felt like a benediction. For the next hour, the house would not be silent. It would be filled with the scent of baking apples and warm spice, a fragrant shield against the quiet. She had done something. It was a small thing, a pie for a stranger, but it was an act of defiance against the gray inertia that had claimed her. It meant nothing, she told herself again, watching the crust begin to brown through the oven door. It was just a pie. The man who answered the door of the Miller cabin did not match the vague image she had formed in her mind. She had expected someone older, perhaps, or someone more polished. The man who stood before her was neither. He was tall, lean, with the kind of weariness that seemed settled deep in his bones, not just on the surface. His hair was dark and unruly, his face weathered by sun and worry. He was dressed in simple, durable work clothes, clean but faded. There was an air of profound stillness about him, as if he had learned to take up as little space in the world as possible. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a deep, clear gray, the color of a winter sky, and they were tired. Yet, behind the tiredness, there was a watchfulness, a careful and considered way of looking that made her feel, for the first time in a very long time, seen. Not assessed or dismissed, but simply seen. "Can I help you?" His voice was low, a little rough, as if from disuse. Elara felt a sudden, foolish awkwardness. The pie, held in both her hands, suddenly felt like a ridiculous and presumptuous offering. "I'm Elara Vance. I live just down the road," she said, her own voice sounding too loud in the quiet air between them. I baked a pie. As a welcome." He looked from her face to the pie, then back to her face. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his gaze. He did not smile, not in the easy, social way she expected. Instead, a faint line appeared between his brows. "You didn't have to do that. It's just a neighborly thing," she insisted, feeling the need to justify the act. "The valley way." He was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her. Then he stepped back, holding the door open wider. "Well, thank you." He reached out and took the pie from her. His fingers brushed against hers, and his hands were, as she expected, calloused and capable, the hands of a man who worked. What she did not expect was the jolt, a small spark of warmth that traveled up her arm. She had tucked a small, folded note under the edge of the crust, tied with a bit of twine. On it, in her neat, looping cursive, she had written a simple message: "Welcome to the valley. Elara Vance." He set the pie down on a small table just inside the door, his back to her for a moment. He fumbled with the twine, his movements suddenly clumsy. He unfolded the note. Elara was about to make her excuses and leave, to retreat back to the safety of her quiet house, but she saw the change in his posture. He went rigid. It was not a dramatic movement, but a sudden, absolute stillness, as if he had been struck. He was staring at the note in his hand, his head bowed. When he turned back to face her, his expression had been wiped clean of all emotion, a mask of careful neutrality. But she had seen it. In the split second before the mask fell, she had seen it. A tightening around his eyes, a flicker of something that looked like shock, or perhaps pain. It was a look of profound, disoriented recognition, and it made no sense at all. He looked from the simple note in his hand to her face, and his gaze was no longer just watchful. It was intense, searching, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly been thrust upon him. "My name is William," he said, his voice strained. He cleared his throat. "William Ashe." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Ashe," she said, the polite words feeling hollow and strange. The air was thick with unspoken questions. The simple, neighborly gesture had become something else entirely, something complicated and unsettling. She felt a powerful urge to flee. "Please, call me William." He was still looking at her with that unnerving intensity. He seemed to be wrestling with some internal decision. The silence stretched, and Elara took a half-step back, preparing her departure. "I should be going," she said. "I hope you enjoy the pie." "Wait," he said, the words sharp enough to stop her. He took a breath, and the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease by a fraction. He was breaking some rule. She could tell, some code he had set for himself. "I'd like to take you for coffee in town. To thank you properly." The invitation was so unexpected it left her speechless for a moment. It was not the way things were done. A polite thank you, a returned pie plate, perhaps an offer of help with some chore in the future. That was the established script. Coffee was different. Coffee was an invitation to talk, to connect. It was a step outside the bounds of simple neighborliness and into something personal. Her first instinct, the instinct of the last 2 years, was to refuse. To make an excuse about being busy, to retreat behind the walls of her fortress. It was the safe thing to do. But then she thought of the oppressive silence of her house, of the gray, featureless landscape of her days. And she looked at this strange, quiet man, at the mystery that seemed to cling to him like the scent of wood smoke. Saying no was a vote for the silence. Saying yes was a small, terrifying act of rebellion against the life she had resigned herself to. "I'd like that," she heard herself say, the words feeling foreign in her own mouth. A flicker of surprise, and perhaps relief, crossed his face. "Tomorrow morning?" "At the diner." "Tomorrow morning," she agreed, her heart hammering against her ribs with a mixture of fear and a feeling so unfamiliar it took her a moment to name it. It was anticipation. The town diner was a narrow building with a long formica counter and a handful of red vinyl booths. It smelled of frying bacon and stale coffee, a scent that was, for Elara, the smell of public life, of a world outside her own farm. She chose a booth by the window, her hands wrapped around a thick ceramic mug of coffee that was more bitter than she liked. She was not nervous. She was not hopeful. She was merely observant. She was a scientist studying a new and unpredictable element that had been introduced into the stable environment of her life. William arrived precisely at 10 o'clock. He moved through the small, crowded space with that same quiet economy of motion she had noticed before, nodding to the waitress but avoiding eye contact with the other patrons. He slid into the booth opposite her, placing his worn hat on the seat beside him. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied. The waitress came, and he ordered coffee, black. When she was gone, a silence fell between them. But it was not the awkward, grasping silence Elara was used to experiencing with people she didn't know well. It wasn't a void that needed to be filled with chatter about the weather or local gossip. It was a comfortable silence, a shared thing. It was as if they both understood that words should be used with intention, not as mere filler. He seemed as comfortable in the quiet as she was, and this shared trait was more intimate than any easy conversation could have been. "This is good coffee," he said finally, after taking a sip from his mug. It was a simple, declarative statement. "It's better than mine," she admitted, and a ghost of a smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, easing the weary lines around his eyes. "I doubt that," he said. It was the best I've ever had." He said it with a sincerity that was almost startling. There was no flattery in his tone, only a statement of fact. "My mother taught me," she said, and then, unsure why, she added, "It was her recipe." He nodded, his gaze dropping to his mug. "It's good to have things like that. From family." The conversation unfolded slowly, in fits and starts. He asked about her farm, and she gave him the brief, edited version, that she ran it alone now, that it was enough to get by. He didn't offer sympathy or ask prying questions about her husband, a courtesy for which she was profoundly grateful. He seemed to understand the boundaries without her having to draw them. In turn, she learned that he had bought the Miller place to fix it up, that he worked with his hands, doing carpentry and repair work. He spoke of wood and tools with a quiet passion, the way she might speak of soil and seeds. They were both people who made and mended things. She found herself relaxing in his presence, the tight knot of anxiety in her stomach slowly unspooling. He was a good listener. He did not interrupt. He simply absorbed her words, his gray eyes fixed on her face, and made her feel as though what she was saying, however mundane, was of immense importance. It was a dangerous feeling, this sense of being heard. As she sat there, listening to him describe his plans for repairing the old cabin's porch, her mind drifted back 2 years, to another conversation that had been a lifeline. It had started with a desperate, impulsive act. 6 months after Daniel's death, the loneliness had become a physical ailment, a sickness of the soul. A friend, seeing her wasting away, had shown her a small advertisement in the back of a respectable literary journal. It was a pen friend's service, a discreet way for like-minded individuals to connect through correspondence. The ad promised intellectual companionship, a meeting of minds, not hearts. On a whim, fueled by a sleepless night and a deep, aching need to speak to someone who was not a neighbor offering a casserole and a pitying glance, she had written a letter. She had used a post office box in the next town over, signing herself only as E. She had not expected a reply. It was a message in a bottle, tossed into an unknown ocean. But a reply had come. A man, signing himself only as W, had written back. His letter was as cautious and tentative as her own. His handwriting was stark and angular, a contrast to her own rounded script. He wrote that he, too, was in a period of quiet contemplation, and that the idea of a conversation without the burden of physical presence appealed to him. And so it began. A correspondence that had now stretched across 2 years and nearly 50 letters. They had never exchanged names, locations, or personal details that could identify them. The anonymity was the key. It was a confessional, a sanctuary built of paper and ink. In the safety of that anonymity, they had built a startling intimacy. He wrote of a great failure in his past, a youthful mistake that had cost others dearly and had shadowed his entire adult life. He wrote of shame as a constant companion, a heavy coat he could never take off. He didn't offer excuses. He simply laid the facts of his regret out for her inspection. He wrote of his longing for a quiet life, for a chance to build something good and honest with his own hands, to balance the scales of his past. In return, she wrote of her grief, not the sanitized version she presented to the world, but the raw, messy truth of it. She wrote about the anger she felt at Daniel for leaving her, a shameful secret she had never spoken aloud. She wrote about the suffocating weight of her neighbor's pity and the terrifying feeling of becoming invisible, of her identity being subsumed into the single, tragic label of widow. She wrote about her promise to herself to never be that vulnerable again, and her fear that in protecting herself, she was building a prison. W understood. He did not offer platitudes. He did not tell her she would move on. He simply acknowledged her pain. Loneliness is not an emptiness, he had written in his third letter, a phrase that had struck her with the force of revelation. It is a presence. I know it well. In that single sentence, she had felt more profoundly understood than she had in her entire life. Their letters became the one place where she did not have to pretend. With W, she was not the sad widow, the capable farm woman, the plain, overlooked neighbor. She was simply E, a mind, a soul, a collection of thoughts and fears laid bare on a page. He saw her, the real her, without ever having laid eyes on her. It was a paradox that had become the central pillar of her emotional survival. A clatter of dishes brought her back to the present, to the diner, to the man sitting across from her. William was looking at her, a question in his careful eyes. "You were a long way away," he said softly. "Just thinking," she said, the excuse feeling flimsy. She felt a flush of guilt, as if she had been caught in an act of infidelity. Her connection with W was a secret garden, and William Ashe was a stranger at the gate. The journey home was quiet, the clip-clop of her horse's hooves a steady rhythm on the dirt road. The air was cool, but the sun was warm on her face. She felt a strange lightness, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. The coffee had been just coffee. The conversation had been simple. And yet, something had shifted. A small window had been opened in a room that had been sealed shut for 2 years. Halfway home, where the road dipped low near Willow Creek, it happened. The ground was still soft from the autumn rains, and the right wheel of her small wagon slid off the packed dirt and into the muddy verge. The wagon lurched, groaned, and then settled with a sickening squelch. The horse strained, but the wheel was mired deep. Elara sighed, a sound of pure exasperation. She climbed down, her boots sinking into the muck. She was strong, but not strong enough to lift a wagon wheel out of deep, sucking mud by herself. She would have to unhitch the horse and ride back to the farm for a shovel and a plank. It would take hours. She was standing there, surveying the problem with a grim sense of resignation, when she heard the sound of an approaching horse. It was William. He was riding, not in a wagon, and he reined in his horse a few yards away. He took in the scene with a single, comprehensive glance: the tilted wagon, the the straining horse, Elara's mud-splattered boots. He didn't say, "Looks like you've got a problem," or offer any other useless observation. He simply dismounted, tied his horse to a nearby tree, and walked over. "Let me," he said. It wasn't a question or an offer, but a statement of intent. He crouched down, examining the angle of the wheel. His presence was calm and focused. He was not performing helpfulness. He was simply being helpful. He asked her to take the horse's reins and gentle it. Then he went to the back of the wagon, braced his shoulder against the corner, and instructed her to urge the horse forward on his count. "Now," he said, his voice a low grunt of effort. She clucked to the horse, which strained forward. At the same time, William put his entire body into the effort, his muscles bunching under his worn shirt. The wagon groaned, resisted, and then, with a great sucking sound, the wheel pulled free from the mud. The wagon lurched forward onto solid ground. He stood up, breathing a little heavily, and wiped a smear of mud from his cheek with the back of his hand. "Thank you," Elara said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. "I'd still be here at sundown if you hadn't come along." "It was nothing," he said, already walking back to his horse. He didn't linger for more thanks. He didn't try to leverage the act of assistance into a longer conversation. He had seen a problem, he had fixed it, and now he was moving on. His competence was as quiet and unassuming as his silence. He nodded to her once, a small, sharp dip of his chin, mounted his horse, and rode away. Elara stood watching him go, a strange mix of relief and something else, something she couldn't quite define, stirring within her. It was respect. The next day, Mrs. Gable intercepted her outside the general store. Martha Gable was the town's primary source of news, speculation, and judgment. She was a small, bird-like woman with eyes that missed nothing and a tongue that reported everything, often with her own embellishments. "Elara, dear," she began, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "I saw that new man, Mr. Ashe, helping you with your wagon yesterday. Very chivalrous." "My wheel was stuck," Elara said, her tone deliberately flat. "Of course, dear. Of course," Mrs. Gable patted her arm, a gesture that was meant to seem comforting but felt proprietary. "It's just, well, a widow must be careful, especially with a stranger. No one seems to know a thing about him. He keeps to himself. A man that quiet. Well, it makes you wonder what he's being quiet about, doesn't it?" Elara felt a sudden, hot flash of anger. It was the same old story. The town saw her not as a person, but as a problem to be managed, a fragile creature to be protected from her own presumed foolishness. They saw her through the lens of her widowhood, and it rendered her invisible. "He was a kind neighbor, Martha," Elara said, her voice colder than she intended. "The mud was the problem, not the man." She turned and walked away, leaving Mrs. Gable with her mouth slightly agape. The defiance felt good. It felt like breathing after being underwater for a very long time. The town could whisper all it wanted. William Ashe had shown her simple, practical kindness, without an ounce of the pity that she had come to despise. And in the face of that, the town's gossip felt like nothing more than the buzzing of flies. A few days later, William appeared at the edge of her property while she was weeding her late-season vegetable garden. He wasn't on the road. He was standing by the stretch of fence that bordered his land. The fence was old, the posts leaning and the rails weathered to a silver gray. She straightened up, wiping her brow with the back of a dirt-caked glove. "William," he nodded in greeting. "Elara," he gestured with his chin toward the dilapidated fence. "That section's in a bad way. A strong wind could take it down." "I know," she said with a sigh. "It's on a long list of things that need fixing." It was a list that had only grown since Daniel's death, a constant, nagging reminder of all the things she couldn't do on her own. He was silent for a moment, his gaze traveling the length of the sagging fence line. "I have some spare posts and rails, left over from a job in town. I could fix it for you." Her immediate instinct was to refuse, to insist on paying him, to resist the idea of being a charity case. "I couldn't let you do that," she began. He cut her off, not rudely, but with a simple finality. "Why not?" He paused, and a rare, wry hint of a smile touched his lips. "You brought me pie." The logic was so simple, so direct, that it disarmed her. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was a transaction, a quid pro quo of kindness. A pie for a fence. It was a language she understood. It was the language of neighbors, of a community, however small. "All right," she said, surprised at how easily the word came. "Thank you." He simply nodded and said, "I'll start tomorrow." He was true to his word. The next morning, she heard the rhythmic thud of a post driver. She went out onto her porch with a cup of tea and watched him. He worked with the same quiet, methodical competence he'd shown with her wagon. He moved with an unhurried efficiency, every action purposeful. He tore out the old, rotten posts, dug new holes, and set the new posts with a level, ensuring they were perfectly plumb. There was a rightness to his work, a deep, ingrained honesty in the way he built things. She found herself making excuses to be outside, weeding a patch of garden that didn't need it, sweeping a porch that was already clean. She liked the sound of his work. It was a companionable noise, a human sound that pushed back against the ever-present silence. It was the sound of something broken being made whole. In the afternoon, she brought him a glass of lemonade. He stopped his work, accepting the glass with a grateful nod. He drank it down in one long draft, the muscles in his throat working. "Thank you," he said, handing the empty glass back to her. He sat on the ground, leaning his back against a newly set post, and she found herself sitting on the top step of her porch. The distance between them was comfortable. It was during one of these shared, quiet breaks that he noticed the leather-bound journal she had left on the small wicker table beside her chair. "You enjoy writing," he stated, not as a question. Elara felt a jolt, a familiar pang of guilt, as if he had caught a glimpse of her secret garden. "Sometimes," she said evasively. "I keep a journal. Farm records, mostly it was a lie." The journal was filled with her thoughts, her fears, drafts of poems, and sometimes, ideas for her letters to W. He seemed to accept her answer, but his next words sent a tremor through her. "I find writing is clearer than speaking, sometimes. You can lay the words out and look at them. Make sure they're the right ones." "Yes," she breathed, the truth of his statement resonating deep within her. "That's it exactly. I used to think being quiet was a failing," he continued, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. "That a man should be able to say what he means, right out." He shook his head slightly. "But words said out loud can't be unsaid. They hang in the air. On paper you can get it right before you send it out into the world." She was so struck by the sentiment, so close to her own feelings about her correspondence with W, that she spoke without thinking. "It's a way to be honest," she said softly, "when you know the person on the other end won't judge you." He turned his head and looked at her. He went very still, the way he had when he'd first read her note. His gray eyes were searching, intense. "Yes," he said, his voice quiet. "I know what you mean. I write to someone, too. It's the only place I don't feel the weight of my past." The moment hung between them, thick with a dramatic irony, so potent it was almost a physical presence. They were like two people standing back to back in a dark room, describing the person they were looking for, never realizing they were describing each other. Alara's heart hammered in her chest. The coincidence was uncanny, unsettling. She felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the solid ground of her two separate worlds, the world with William and the world with W, was beginning to tremble and shift beneath her feet. He broke the spell, pushing himself to his feet. "I should get back to it," he said, his tone once again neutral, businesslike. He turned back to the fence, and the moment was over. But it left an echo, a question that vibrated in the air between them. The annual town harvest social was held in the large, grassy field behind the church. It was an event Elara had dutifully attended with Daniel, and one she had assiduously avoided for the past 2 years. The thought of navigating the sea of well-meaning but pitying faces was more than she could bear. But this year, something was different. A tiny seed of courage, or perhaps just curiosity, had taken root. She decided to go. She wore a simple blue dress, one she hadn't worn since before Daniel's death. It felt strange, like a costume from another life. She felt exposed, visible, and the urge to turn back, to retreat to the safety of her farm, was immense. But she pushed on. William was there, as she had suspected he might be. He was not mingling. He stood on the periphery of the crowd, near the old oak tree, holding a cup of cider, observing the festivities with his characteristic quiet stillness. He looked out of place, a solitary figure against the boisterous backdrop of the social. When he saw her, his expression did not change, but she saw a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes. She found herself drifting in his direction, drawn by the quiet gravity of his presence. It was a relief to stand beside him, on the edge of the noise and the chatter. They didn't need to talk. They simply stood beside each other, watching the townsfolk, and the shared silence was a small, protected space in the middle of the crowd. It felt natural. It felt, she admitted to herself with a jolt of alarm, dangerously comfortable. Mrs. Gable, of course, did not miss this development. Elara could feel the woman's sharp-eyed gaze from across the field. She could already hear the whispers that would ripple through the town tomorrow. The widow and the stranger. But for the first time, she found that she didn't much care. Standing here, in the quiet company of this man, she felt more herself than she had in the suffocating embrace of the community's concern. As dusk began to settle, the pastor announced the traditional sharing of talents. It was usually a predictable affair. A few hymns sung off-key, a child reciting a memorized Bible verse, a farmer's wife showing off a prize-winning quilt. Elara always found it excruciating. But tonight, something moved in her. It was a strange, reckless impulse, born of the blue dress and the comfortable silence and the feeling of being, for a moment, someone other than the grieving widow. In her pocket was a small, folded piece of paper. On it was a poem she had written just last week, after receiving a particularly moving letter from W. He had written about a lone tree he had seen once on a high, windswept ridge. He described it as a study in resilience, its branches permanently bent in one direction by the relentless wind, its roots clinging to the rocky soil. He saw it as a metaphor for a person shaped by a single, powerful force from their past, bent but not broken. It was not beautiful, he had written, but it was honest. It did not hide what the wind had done to it. Her poem was about that tree. It was short, only 3 stanzas, and it spoke of the beauty of honest scars and the strength of misshapen things. When the pastor asked if there were any others who wished to share, Elara heard her own voice, thin and reedy, say, "I have something." A surprised murmur went through the crowd. Elara Vance, the quiet widow, had never volunteered for anything. She felt 100 pairs of eyes turn to her. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked at a point just above their heads, at the darkening sky. She read. Her voice grew stronger with each line. The words were her own, but the feeling behind them belonged to her and W, a secret shared in plain sight. The wind told its one story. To the tree upon the hill, it bent the boughs and shaped the wood, and holds it captive still. As she spoke the second stanza, her eyes, against her will, found William. He was no longer leaning against the tree. He was standing straight, his cup of cider forgotten in his hand. He was staring at her, and his face, usually so guarded, was completely open. He was not just still, he was frozen. His face had gone pale under his weathered skin, and his eyes were wide with a look of dawning, horrified comprehension. The poem was not just a poem. It was a key. It was the specific, unique imagery from a private letter, spoken aloud in her voice. For him, it was the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. The woman he had been corresponding with, the soul he had bared his own to, was not some abstract in a distant town. She was Elara Vance. She was here. She finished the last line, her voice faltering at the raw shock on his face. It wears the wind's confession, for all the world to see, a testament of what can break, and what refuses to be. A polite, slightly confused applause rippled through the crowd, but Elara didn't hear it. She was looking at William. As soon as the applause started, the mask of neutrality slammed back down on his face, but it was too late. She had seen. He turned, without a word, without a glance back, and walked away from the social, disappearing into the gathering dark. Elara stood there, the flimsy piece of paper trembling in her hand, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She didn't understand what had just happened. She only knew that she had shared something beautiful and secret, and it had sent him running as if he'd seen a ghost. William stumbled away from the light and the noise of the social, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't stop walking until he was deep in the woods that bordered the church field, the sounds of the gathering fading behind him. He leaned against the rough bark of a pine tree, gasping for air he didn't realize he'd been holding. No, It wasn't possible. But it was. The note with the pie. Her handwriting. He'd recognized it instantly. The elegant, rounded script so achingly familiar from the letters he kept tied in a bundle in his cabin. He had told himself it was a coincidence, a trick of the light, a hopeful delusion. Her name, Elara. He had pushed the thought away as a wild, impossible fancy. But the poem, that was no coincidence. The tree on the hill, the wind's confession, those were his words, his thoughts, sent in a letter just last week, a private confession of his own scarred soul. And she had taken them, woven them into a poem, and spoken them aloud in her soft, steady voice. Elara Vance, the quiet, kind-hearted widow who had brought him a pie, was the woman whose strength and honesty he had come to admire from afar. The faceless correspondent who had become his confessor and his closest confidant was the very same woman whose presence next to him at the social had felt like a small, quiet harbor. The realization crashed over him not as a joyful revelation, but as a tidal wave of pure terror. For 2 years, he had poured his darkest secrets onto the page for her. He had told her everything, not just the vague shape of his shame, but the specifics. He had told her about his youthful folly, his desperate need for a start in life leading him to take a job with a man named Alistair Thorne. He'd told her how Thorne, with his easy charm and promises of wealth, had used him. How he, William, a naive boy of 20, had been the clerk for Thorne's land company, his neat signature on dozens of documents he barely understood. Documents that had cheated hard-working families out of their rightful land, transferring titles through fraud and coercion. He had written to about the day he finally understood the nature of Thorne's business, the sick, hollow feeling in his gut. He had told her of his confrontation with Thorne, the man's easy dismissal of his moral outrage, the cold thread in his eyes. He had confessed how he had fled, carrying the shame of his complicity like a physical burden. And most damningly, he had told her, in his most recent letters, why he had come to this specific valley. Because Alistair Thorne lived here, a respected, powerful man. Because many of the families Thorne had defrauded lived here, trapped in tenancy on land that should have been theirs. Because he, William Ashe, had spent the last 5 years painstakingly gathering evidence, copies of deeds, letters, anything he could find to prove Thorne's crimes. He had come here to try, in some small way, to make it right. He had laid all of this at her feet, this anonymous, compassionate stranger. And now that stranger had a face, a name, a farm that bordered his own, a farm that was vulnerable. To reveal himself as W now would be to taint everything. It would mean confessing that he was not just a quiet carpenter, but a man with a past so tangled with the valley's most predatory figure that it put him, and anyone associated with him, in danger. He had come to admire her, this real, physical Elara. He had been drawn to her quiet strength, her resilience. The thought of his past dirtying her life, of Thorne turning his cold, calculating gaze upon her, was unbearable. She would hate him. When she learned that the man she had shared her deepest grief with was also a man connected, however unwillingly, to such deceit, she would see him as just another lie. The fragile, tentative connection they had begun to build, the comfortable silence, the shared lemonade, the pie, it would all shatter. He pushed himself off the tree, his course set. He could not tell her. He had to pull away. He had to become the quiet, aloof stranger the town already believed him to be. It was the only way to protect her. The irony was a knife in his gut. The one person in the world who knew his truest self was the one person he could never be honest with. Elara spent the next 2 days in a state of bewildered hurt. William's abrupt departure felt like a slap. He had not just left, he had fled. She replayed the moment in her mind 100 times. The shock on his face had been genuine, profound. It was as if her poem had been a personal affront, a trespass. But how? It was about a tree. She avoided the road, keeping to the back of her property, not wanting to risk seeing him. The silence of her house, which had briefly receded, came rushing back in, thicker and more oppressive than before. The brief glimmer of light had been extinguished, leaving the darkness deeper than it had been. On the 3rd day, a fine, handsome carriage, far too elegant for the rutted dirt road, pulled up in front of her farmhouse. A liveried driver opened the door, and a man stepped out. He was in his late 50s, tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored wool suit. He had a full head of silver hair and a face that was both handsome and predatory, like a hawk. He moved with an air of absolute ownership, as if the very ground he walked on belonged to him. Elara, who had been on her porch mending a harness, stood up, her heart giving a sudden, anxious lurch. She recognized him from town. This was Alistair Thorne, the wealthiest man in the county, owner of the lumber mill, the bank, and half the land for miles around. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice smooth as polished river stone. He smiled, but it didn't reach his cold, assessing eyes. He removed his hat. "Alistair Thorne, forgive the intrusion." "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice tight. "What can I do for you? I was just passing by. I admire what you've done with this place." It takes a strong character to manage a farm alone. The compliment felt less like praise and more like an evaluation. "It's my home," she said simply. He nodded, his gaze sweeping over her property before settling on the new section of fence William had built. "I see you've had some work done." A good, sturdy fence. His eyes slid from the fence to her face. "Your new neighbor, I presume?" "A Mr. Ash." "Yes," she said, her guard up. Thorne's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "He's a capable carpenter, I'll give him that. But a man's skill with a hammer doesn't always speak to his character." He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a confidential murmur. "I only mention it, Mrs. Vance, because I have a certain civic responsibility. I've made some inquiries about our Mr. Ash. It seems he has a complicated past. Left his last town rather abruptly, I hear. There were troubles. Financial troubles." He paused, letting the insinuation hang in the air. "A woman in your position, a widow, one must be so careful who one associates with. People can be opportunistic. They see a woman alone, a nice piece of land, they see an opportunity." The threat was unspoken, but it was as clear as the autumn air. It was a warning. Stay away from William Ash. The message was not for her benefit, it was for Thorne's. Why would a man of his stature care about a poor carpenter and a reclusive widow? The question ignited a spark of fear, but also a fierce, protective anger. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice like ice. "But I am perfectly capable of judging a man's character for myself." Thorne's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, the mask of civility slipping to reveal the cold predator beneath. He had expected a timid, grateful woman. He had not expected defiance. He replaced his smile, but it was brittle now. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Of course you are." He put his hat back on. "A lovely day." He turned, walked back to his carriage, and was gone, leaving a trail of dust and a thick residue of menace. Elara stood on her porch, her hands clenched into fists, her mind racing. Thorne's visit had changed everything. This was not about a poem. This was not about a clumsy social interaction. This was about something bigger, something dangerous, and William was at the center of it. That evening, as dusk was bleeding into night, she saw a figure walking up her lane. It was William. He looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept in days. He stopped at the bottom of her porch steps, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. "Elara," he began, his voice low and strained. "I need to apologize for my behavior at the social. It was rude, inexcusable." "Why did you leave, William?" she asked, her voice quiet. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the wooden planks of the porch. "Your poem, it was beautiful. It reminded me of something. Something from my past." The lie was clumsy, inadequate, and they both knew it. She decided to force the issue. "Alistair Thorne paid me a visit this morning." William's head snapped up. The exhaustion on his face was replaced by sharp alarm. "What? What did he want?" "He wanted to warn me about you," she said, watching his face carefully. "He told me you have a complicated past. He suggested you were an opportunist." A muscle jumped in William's jaw. He looked away, his shoulders slumping. He looked utterly defeated. "He's not wrong," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "About the past. It is complicated." He took a deep breath and looked at her, his eyes filled with a torment that tore at her heart. "Elara, there are things you should know about me. Things that aren't good. Mr. Thorne, he has a reason to dislike me. A very old reason. I came here hoping to leave it all behind, but it seems I can't." He was trying to tell her something. He was trying to warn her, just as Thorne had, but for a different reason. Thorne had warned her to isolate William. William was warning her to protect herself. He was confessing to a darkness in his history, but he couldn't bring himself to name it. He was giving her a partial, painful truth, wrapped in shame. He still hadn't mentioned the letters. He was trying to keep that one part of his life separate, to protect her from the man he believed himself to be. "What reason, William?" she pressed gently. He shook his head, a look of profound misery on his face. "I can't. If I tell you, I can't involve you in this. It's better if you just stay away from me. Thorn is a dangerous man." He turned to leave, a man retreating into his own prison. "William, wait," she called after him. But he just shook his head and kept walking, a solitary figure swallowed by the twilight. The next morning, Elara rode to the post office in the next town, a knot of dread in her stomach. Her conversation with William had left her with more questions than answers. She needed something solid, something true. She needed a letter from W. There was one waiting for her. His letters usually arrived every 2 weeks, like clockwork. This one was early. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It must have been posted before the harvest social, before everything had fractured. She sat on a bench outside the post office and began to read. "My dearest E," it began. "I find I must write to you sooner than planned. I am on the verge of something, a precipice, and I feel I cannot move forward without being completely honest with you, as you have always been with me. I have told you of my shame, of the great mistake of my youth. Now I feel I must give it a name and a face, if only to rob it of its power over me." Her blood ran cold. She read on, her eyes flying across the angular script. "The man's name is Alastair Thorn. The company was the Northern Valley Land Development Corporation. It was a lie from top to bottom. He used my hand, my signature, my youthful ignorance, to steal land from good people. He built his fortune on their loss, and I was his clerk, his unwitting accomplice. I have lived with this for 15 years. I have told you I came to a new place to find peace, but that is only half the truth. I came here because this is where he is. This is where the families he ruined still live. I came here, with a box of evidence I have spent years collecting. I came here to see justice done. I do not know if I have the courage to see it through. I fear him. He is a man who crushes whatever stands in his way. But I had to tell you the full truth. You are the only person who knows the real shape of me. Yours, W." Elara read the letter 3 times, her mind struggling to connect the pieces. Alastair Thorn, the man from the carriage, the man who had threatened her, William's torment, his warning. Thorn has a reason to dislike me. And this letter, this final, devastating confession from the one person she had trusted unconditionally. W was William. The thought was so immense, so world-altering, that she felt she couldn't breathe. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a certainty. She lay awake all night in her cold bed, the silence of the house a roaring in her ears. The last week replayed in her mind, but now all the pieces fit together with a terrible, perfect clarity. The pie. His strange reaction to her handwriting on the note. He had recognized it. Of course he had. He had been reading it for 2 years. The conversation about writing. On paper you can get it right. His uncanny echo of her own feelings. They hadn't been talking about a similar experience. They had been talking about the same experience. The poem, The Tree on the Hill. It hadn't been an affront. It had been a confirmation. It was the moment his suspicion had hardened into fact. It was the moment he knew that E was Elara. His flight from the social wasn't because he was offended. It was because he was terrified. And Thorn's visit wasn't random. Thorn knew William was in the valley. He knew William was a threat. He was trying to isolate him, to poison the well, to cut him off from his only potential ally. No, her mind whispered, a last, desperate act of denial. It was too much, too coincidental, too cruel. The man she was tentatively, cautiously, beginning to feel something for, and the man she had poured her soul out to on paper, they could not be the same person. It would mean the universe had a sense of humor that was both breathtaking and monstrous. But what if? What if the quiet, capable man who fixed her fence was the same man who had written, "Loneliness is not an emptiness. It is a presence"? What if the man whose tired, gray eyes seemed to see right through her was the same one who had confessed his deepest shame to her? It meant that the two separate, carefully compartmentalized worlds of her heart had just collided. The safe, anonymous confidant and the real, tangible, complicated man were one and the same. And he had known. Since the poem, At least, he had known and had said nothing. The next morning, she saw him coming. She was sitting on her porch, the letter from W on the table beside her, her mind a calm, cold battlefield. She watched him walk up the lane, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of grim resolution. He was coming to confess. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, just as he had before. He took off his hat, holding it in both hands like a shield. He looked exhausted, broken. "Elara," he began, and his voice was raw, hoarse. "There's something I have to tell you. Something I should have told you the moment I was sure." He took a ragged breath and finally met her eyes. The shame and fear in his gaze were so profound they were almost a physical force. "I'm W." He braced himself for her anger, for her accusations, for the door to be slammed in his face. Elara looked at him, the man who was both a stranger and the person who knew her best in all the world. The storm inside her had passed, leaving behind a strange, desolate calm. "I know," she said, her voice quiet. His carefully constructed composure shattered. He stared at her, his mouth slightly open, confusion warring with the shame on his face. "What? How?" She gestured to the letter on the table. "It came yesterday. He told me everything. About Thorn. About why he was here." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "He told me everything you couldn't." The hurt that rose in her was not what he had expected. It was not the fiery anger of betrayal at a lie. It was a deeper, colder, more profound wound. "I'm not angry that you didn't tell me, William," she said, and her voice trembled for the first time. I'm hurt because of what you took from me." W was safe. W was a stranger in another town, a name on a page. He was the one person I could be completely honest with because he wasn't real. He couldn't hurt me. He couldn't show up at my door. He couldn't be threatened by a man like Alistair Thorne. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sharp. "You knew. You knew at the social, and you said nothing. You let me think I had done something wrong. You let me sit in my house for 2 days, feeling foolish and rejected. And all the while, you knew you were him." She stood up, wrapping her arms around herself. "You didn't just lie by omission, William. You took away the one safe place I had in the world. You made him real. And you made him vulnerable. And you made me vulnerable." He took a step toward her, his hand outstretched, his face a canvas of regret. "Elara, I'm so sorry. I was trying to protect you." "I don't need your protection," she said, the words sharp as flint. "I need honesty. The man in the letters, he was always honest. Painfully honest. But you stood in my house, and you couldn't give me that." She didn't shout. She didn't throw him out. She did something far worse. She withdrew. The tentative warmth that had grown between them was gone, replaced by a sheet of ice. "I need time," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I need time to think. To figure out who you are. To figure out if the man who wrote those letters still exists, or if he was just another story." She turned and walked into her house, closing the doors softly behind her, leaving him alone on the porch with the full weight of her quiet, devastating judgment. For 3 days, Elara did not leave her farm. The world outside her property lines ceased to exist. The shock had subsided, leaving in its wake a landscape of emotional wreckage that she had to navigate. She did not weep. She worked. She split firewood with a ferocity that left her arms aching. She mucked out the chicken coop. She repaired the latch on the barn door. She threw herself into the physical, tangible world, a world where problems had simple, physical solutions. But in the quiet moments, in the evenings when the work was done, she confronted the truth. She took the bundle of letters from the locked wooden box where she kept them. There were 47 of them. She untied the worn ribbon and laid them out on her kitchen table in chronological order. She began to read. She was not reading for comfort or for the memory of the connection they had shared. She was not looking for romance. She was on a mission. She was an investigator, a historian, searching for the truth of a man she thought she knew. She was trying to find the real shape of him, to see if the William Ashe who had stood on her porch, crippled by his shame, was the same man as the W who had emerged, line by line, over the past 2 years. She read about his early, vague confessions of a past mistake. She saw the shame, but also the thread of accountability that ran through it. He never blamed anyone else. The fault, he wrote, was his own. He had been weak and naive, and others had paid the price. She read about his solitary life, his work as a carpenter, the simple satisfaction he took in mending broken things. It was a clear, quiet echo of the man who had fixed her fence, not for payment, but because you brought me pie. She read his responses to her own outpourings of grief and loneliness. He never offered easy answers or hollow platitudes. He offered something far more valuable, recognition. I know that quiet, he had written once. It is a room you cannot find the door out of. He had not tried to rescue her from her pain. He had simply sat with her in it, a silent companion across the miles. As she read, letter after letter, a clear picture emerged. W was a man defined by a single, profound regret, but he was not defined by weakness. He was a man of immense moral courage, even if he did not see it in himself. He had spent years trying to gather the tools to right a wrong, not for his own redemption, but for the sake of the people who had been hurt. He was careful. He was quiet. He was methodical. And above all, in the sanctuary of their anonymous correspondence, he had been painfully, relentlessly honest. The man in the letters was not a story. He was real. And he was the same man who had fixed her fence, helped with her wagon, and stood beside her in comfortable silence at the harvest social. He was also the same man who had been too afraid, too ashamed, to tell her the final truth to her face. His silence had not been a malicious deception. It had been an act of misguided protection, born of the same shame he had so honestly described in his letters. He was afraid of his past tainting her. He was afraid of losing her. By the third night, when she read the final letter again, the one naming Thorn, the ice around her heart had begun to thaw. Her hurt had not vanished, but it was now joined by a different, more powerful emotion, a cold, clear-eyed anger. Not at William. At Alistair Thorn. Thorn was the source of the shame that had haunted William for 15 years. Thorn was the man who had come to her home and issued veiled threats. Thorn was the predator, and William, in his own quiet way, was the man trying to stop him. And she, Elara, was caught in the middle. She blew out the lamp and sat in the dark. She was not the fragile widow Thorn had imagined her to be. And she was not a passive victim of William's complicated past. She was a woman who owned a farm, who knew how to work, who had survived the deepest loss imaginable. Thorn had underestimated her, and perhaps so had William. The next morning, she put on her sturdiest boots, walked out of her house, and strode across the field that separated her farm from his. William saw her coming from his cabin window. He had spent the last 3 days in a self-imposed hell, certain he had destroyed the most important connection of his life. He had seen the light in her window at night and had respected her silence, her need for time. Now, seeing her purposefully striding toward his home, his heart seized with dread. This was it, the final verdict. He met her on his porch, his face grim, prepared for the final rejection. She stopped before him, her expression unreadable. It was not soft or forgiving. It was calm, resolute. "I'm not here to forgive you yet," she said, her voice firm, cutting him off before he could begin the apology that was already forming on his lips. "That will take time. The hurt is real, and you don't get to wave it away with an apology." He flinched, but nodded, accepting the blow. "I know. I'm here," she continued, her eyes locking with his, "because I've been thinking. Alistair Thorn warned me away from you. He sent a man in a fancy carriage to my door to tell me to be careful. Powerful men don't do that unless they're afraid. Why is he afraid of you, William?" The question completely altered the landscape between them. She had not come to discuss their feelings, their betrayal, their letters. She had come for a strategy session. She had looked at the entire, messy situation and had identified the real enemy. In that moment, she was not the hurt woman, the object of his protection. She was his ally. A wave of disbelief and overwhelming relief washed over him. He stared at her, at the quiet strength in her face, the intelligence in her clear eyes. He had been so focused on his own shame, so convinced he had to shield her, that he had failed to see her for who she truly was, not a fragile flower, but a force to be reckoned with. "Come inside," he said, his voice thick with emotion. It was the first time she had been inside his cabin. It was sparse, clean, and orderly. A simple bed, a table and 2 chairs, a stone fireplace. The air smelled of sawdust and lemon oil. It was the home of a man who owned little but took care of what he had. On the table was a small, locked wooden box, the same box he had described in his letters. He motioned for her to sit, and then he began to talk. He told her everything, leaving nothing out. He filled in the gaps from the letters, giving her names, dates, and places. He described the families, the Abernethys, the Snyders, the Garzas, who had lost their land. He explained how Thorne had used legal loopholes and fraudulent surveys, with William's own signature on the bottom of the documents, to seize their properties for pennies on the dollar when they couldn't pay the artificially inflated taxes. He talked about his shame, not as an abstract concept, but as a living thing he had carried for 15 years. He told her about his decision to finally confront it, to come here, to this valley, and try to undo the damage he had helped cause. He unlocked the box and showed her the contents. It was a meticulous collection of evidence. Faded copies of deeds, letters from Thorne to his partners outlining the scheme, sworn affidavits from 2 other former employees who were too afraid to come forward publicly but had given him their stories. It was a lifetime of a man's guilt, transformed into a weapon for justice. Elara listened without interruption. She looked through the papers, her expression grim and focused. She was not looking at him with pity. She was looking at the evidence with the cool assessment of a general surveying a battlefield. "He knows you have this," she stated. It wasn't a question. "He knows I might," William corrected. "He knows I was the one who was there, who saw it all. He doesn't know what I have, specifically, but my presence here is enough to make him nervous." As if on cue, a sound from outside broke the quiet of the cabin. It was the frantic whinny of a horse. William was instantly on his feet and out the door, Elara right behind him. He had 2 horses, which he kept in a small, fenced pasture behind the cabin. Now, there was only one. The remaining horse was agitated, circling the pasture, calling for its companion. The gate was closed, the latch secure. But a section of the fence, far from the gate, had been neatly dismantled. The rails were laid carefully on the ground. It was not the work of a common thief in a hurry. It was a message. One of William's horses was simply gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no tracks other than William's own. It was a quiet, clean, deniable act of intimidation. It was Thorne's response to their alliance, though he could not have known of it. It was a response to William's mere existence. It was designed to do 2 things: to show William he was vulnerable, that Thorne could reach out and take what was his at any time. And it was designed to damage his reputation in the valley. A newcomer who loses a horse is either careless or unlucky, and in a small community, both were marks against a man. William stared at the empty pasture, his face a grim mask of fury and helplessness. "He's starting," he said, his voice low. Elara looked from the dismantled fence to William's face, and her resolve, which had been hardening for days, now tempered into pure steel. The time for hurt feelings was over. This was a fight. She turned to him, her voice leaving no room for argument. "This box," she said, pointing back toward the cabin. "It's not safe here. He'll come for it next, or he'll find a way to have the sheriff come for it." "Where can I take it?" he asked, his mind still reeling from the theft. "He has eyes everywhere." "He won't look for it at my house," she said. "He thinks I'm a timid widow. He thinks I'm a pawn, a weakness of yours. He would never believe I'd be a willing participant. The safest place to hide something is with the person no one would ever suspect." William turned to her, his eyes wide with alarm. "No, absolutely not. Elara, you saw what he did. This is what I was afraid of. I will not put you in that kind of danger. I can't ask you to take that risk." She met his panicked gaze with a look of unshakable calm. "You're not asking me, William," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I am telling you. This is what is going to happen. You think this is your fight, your risk, your guilt to carry alone. It stopped being that the moment Thorne came to my door. It stopped being that the moment you decided to stand up to him. This affects the whole valley. It affects my neighbors. It affects me." She took a step closer, forcing him to meet her eyes. "It is not your risk to give or withhold from me. It is my risk, and I am choosing to take it. You have spent 15 years carrying this burden alone. You are not alone anymore." He stared at her, speechless. In her face, he saw not fear or recklessness, but a deep, quiet, immovable resolve. She was not offering to help him. She was joining him. She was claiming her own agency in this fight, refusing to be the protected, passive woman he had tried to make her. It was the most terrifying and the most magnificent thing he had ever seen. Finally, he gave a single, slow nod. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, William carried the heavy wooden box across the field and delivered it into Elara's hands. She hid it beneath the floorboards in her pantry, under a stack of preserved jams and jellies, in the last place anyone would ever think to look. As she replaced the board, she felt the weight of the secret settle into the foundation of her home. It was no longer just her house. It was a fortress. It was the headquarters of a quiet rebellion. Thorne's next move was more direct, more public. He had tried intimidation and failed. Now he would use the law as his weapon. A week after the horse was stolen, a grimy, hard-bitten drifter named Jed appeared in town. He went directly to the office of the local magistrate, a man known to be in Thorne's pocket, and filed a sworn statement. The statement claimed that 2 weeks prior, a man matching William's description had tried to sell him a horse at a suspiciously low price on a back road miles from the valley. The description of the horse matched William's stolen animal perfectly. Jed claimed he had refused the offer, suspecting the horse was stolen. Now, hearing that a newcomer named Ash had recently lost a horse, he was coming forward as a civic duty. It was a transparently false accusation, but it was a formal one. The magistrate issued a summons for William. It wasn't an arrest, not yet, but it was a legal entanglement, a black mark on his name. The whispers started immediately, fanned by the ever-present Mrs. Gable. The stranger, the horse thief. I told you there was something off about him. Thorne was methodically stripping William of his reputation, isolating him, painting him as a criminal before he could ever bring his own accusations. When William brought the news to Elara, his face was pale with a new kind of fear. This wasn't about a stolen horse anymore. This was about prison. He's boxing me in, William said, pacing the floor of her small kitchen. He'll use this to get a warrant to search my cabin. He won't find the documents, but he'll plant something. More stolen goods. By the time I get out of this mess, my word will be worth nothing. No one will believe a thing I say against him. His fear was not for himself, but for their cause. But as he looked at Elara, her calm face a stark contrast to his own agitation, another fear, more immediate and personal, gripped him. You have to leave, he said, the words coming out in a rush. Elara, you have to go now. Go and stay with your cousin in Ridgefield. Just until this is over. If they connect you to me, if Thorne even suspects you're involved, he'll come after you. He'll ruin you. He was trying to build a wall around her again, to push her out of the line of fire. It was his first, deepest instinct, to protect her. Elara stopped him by placing a hand on his arm. Her touch was firm, grounding. When he looked at her, he saw not fear, but a cold, simmering anger. No, she said, her voice low and intense. Listen to me, William. You do not get to do this. You do not get to decide for me what is too dangerous. You do not get to push me away to keep me safe. I chose to be in this. I chose to hide that box under my floor. My name is now tied to yours, whether you like it or not. She took a step back, her eyes flashing. You do not get to decide now, when things are getting difficult, that my involvement is no longer acceptable. My safety is my concern, not a weapon for you to use to keep me at a distance. I am not a child to be sent away when the adults are talking. I am your partner in this. Or I am nothing. Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. She was right. His instinct to protect her was also an instinct to control her, to diminish her role, to deny her agency. He was treating her exactly as the town did, as a fragile widow who needed saving. He saw the proud, fierce intelligence in her eyes and felt a profound sense of shame. A shame entirely different from the one he had carried for so long. You're right, he said, his voice hoarse. I'm sorry. I was wrong. Good, she said, her tone softening slightly. The crisis had passed. The partnership was affirmed, stronger than before. Now, let's make a plan. The local magistrate is useless. We need to go over his head. They spent the rest of the day in strategic planning. Their greatest asset was the box under the pantry floor. Their greatest liability was time. The summons gave William 2 weeks before a formal hearing. There's a circuit judge, Elara said, remembering conversations from her father years ago. Judge Miller. He comes through twice a year. He's a hard man, but fair. He's not from here. He can't be bought by Thorne. William nodded, a spark of hope in his eyes. When is he due? He's set to hold court in the county seat in 10 days. It was a slim window. They couldn't risk transporting the entire box of evidence. If they were caught, they would lose everything. We copy the most important documents, Elara decided. The Abernathy deed, with your signature and Thorne's on it. The letters from his partners. The affidavit from the other clerk. Her mind was sharp, clear, cutting through the problem. We don't send them through the mail. Thorne could have someone watching the post office. We need a messenger. Someone no one would suspect. Her thoughts immediately went to the families William had told her about. The Snyder family had a son, a boy of 15 named Thomas, quick-witted and reliable. His family had lost their farm to Thorne a decade ago. They hated him with a quiet, simmering passion. Thomas Snyder, Elara said. He can ride. He's smart. And he has a reason to want to see Thorne fall. The plan was set. Elara would carefully copy the chosen documents in her neat, clear hand. Thomas would ride them to the county seat, along with a letter co-signed by Elara and William, formally requesting Judge Miller's intervention and a public hearing. It was a gamble. They were showing their hand to a man they hoped was just, trusting him to see the truth. Thorne, however, was not a man who waited for his enemies to act. He had a network of eyes and ears throughout the valley, from the magistrate to gossips like Mrs. Gable. He may not have known the specifics of their plan, but he sensed a shift. He sensed a resolve in William that hadn't been there before, and he correctly guessed that Elara was the source of it. He decided it was time to target her directly. He did not send a thug. His methods were more insidious. One afternoon, while Elara was in her garden, another carriage arrived. This time, it was not Thorne himself, but his wife, a pale, elegantly dressed woman named Beatrice. She carried a basket of tea cakes and wore a pained, sympathetic smile. "My dear Mrs. Vance," she began, her voice soft and gentle. "My husband told me of his visit, and I fear he may have been abrupt. He worries so for the good people of this valley." Elara remained standing, her hands covered in dirt, making no move to invite the woman in. "What do you want, Mrs. Thorne?" Beatrice's smile wavered for a second. "I came as a friend." As one woman to another, she set the basket down on the porch rail. This town can be unkind, especially to a woman on her own. Tongues wag. "I have heard the whispers about you and this Mr. Ash." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, laced with poison. "A man like that, a stranger with no ties, no name, they can be very charming, especially to a lonely heart. But one must ask what he truly wants. Men like that, they see a woman with a good farm, no husband to protect her. They see her as convenient. They use her for her land, for a roof over their heads, and when they are done, they move on, leaving her with nothing but a ruined reputation." Every word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to strike at Elara's deepest insecurities. Her loneliness, her status as a widow, her fear of being used, her vulnerability to the town's judgment. It was a cruel, precise, and devastatingly personal attack. Elara felt a cold fury rise within her, so pure and potent it burned away any fear or doubt. Thorne and his wife saw her as a weak point, a foolish, lonely woman to be manipulated. They had made a grave mistake. She looked Beatrice Thorne directly in the eye, her gaze hard as granite. "You came here to deliver a threat for your husband," Elara said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You can go back and give him a message from me. Tell him he has mistaken me for someone who is afraid of him. Tell him he has mistaken me for someone who is weak. And tell him that he will regret it." Beatrice Thorne's face went white. The mask of gentle concern dissolved, revealing a pinched, spiteful anger. She snatched her basket of tea cakes from the rail and retreated to her carriage without another word. The threat did not make Elara retreat. It solidified her resolve into something unbreakable. Thorne had shown her his strategy. He believed she was the weak link, and she would use that miscalculation against him. That evening, she did not copy the documents. Instead, she hitched her horse to her wagon. She placed a single, carefully chosen letter from William's box into her handbag. It was not one of the legal documents. It was a desperate, pleading letter written 15 years ago by a woman named Clara Robeson, a widow whose farm had been the first one Thorne had taken, a woman who had been left destitute and had been forced to leave the valley in shame. She did not tell William where she was going. This was a task for her, and her alone. She was the underestimated widow. She would use it as her shield and her sword. Her first stop was the Abernathy farm. They were now tenants on land their family had owned for 3 generations. She found Mrs. Abernathy on her porch, mending clothes, her face etched with a permanent look of worry. Elara did not make a grand speech. She sat with the woman and she listened. She listened to the story of how they had lost their land, of the confusing tax notices, of Thorne's empty promises of help. When Mrs. Abernathy was done, Elara simply said, "He is trying to do the same to William Ashe. And to me." Then she took out the letter. "This was written by a widow named Clara Robeson 15 years ago," she said, and she read it aloud. The story in the letter was a mirror of the Abernathy's own. The same lies, the same tactics, the same heartbreak. When she was finished, Mrs. Abernathy was weeping silently. "We thought we were the only ones," she whispered. "You're not," Elara said. "And we have a chance to stop him. Judge Miller is coming. William Ashe has evidence. But we need more than evidence. We need voices. We need people who are willing to stand up and tell the truth." She did the same at the Snyder farm, and then the Garzas. She did not pressure them. She did not make promises of victory. She simply showed them they were not alone. She offered them a choice, to remain silent in their fear, or to stand together in a fragile, terrifying hope. Her quiet courage, the courage of a woman everyone had written off, was more persuasive than any fiery speech could have been. It was contagious. By the time she returned to her farm late that night, she had secured her allies. The stage was set for the hearing. The hearing was held not in the small magistrate's office, but in the town church, the only building large enough to accommodate the crowd that had gathered. The news of the dispute had spread like wildfire, and nearly the entire valley was present. It was a public spectacle, exactly as Thorne had intended, though he was about to find the script had been radically rewritten. Judge Miller was a stern, unsmiling man with intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He sat at a simple table at the front of the church, the local magistrate looking small and irrelevant beside him. Thorne and his lawyer sat at a table to the right. Elara and William sat at a table to the left. Behind them sat the Abernathy's, the Snyders, and the Garzas, a small, terrified, but resolute block of allies. Thorne's case was presented first. His lawyer called the drifter, Jed, to the stand. The man repeated his story with a practiced, greasy confidence, describing how William had tried to sell him the stolen horse. It sounded plausible, damning. The crowd murmured. Thorne allowed himself a small, confident smile. Then, Judge Miller turned to William. "Mr. Ashe, your response." William stood. "Your Honor, I did not steal that horse. It was stolen from me. But I am not the one who will offer my defense." He sat down, and a confused ripple went through the church. Then, Elara stood up. A hush fell over the room. The widow Vance. What could she possibly have to say? Mrs. Gable leaned forward in her pew, her eyes wide. "Your Honor," Elara began, her voice clear and steady, resonating in the silent church. "My name is Elara Vance. Mr. Ashe is my neighbor. And Mr. Thorne is a liar and a thief." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Thorne's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection. This is slander." "Sit down, counsel," Judge Miller said, his gaze fixed on Elara. "Let the woman speak." Elara looked directly at Jed, the paid witness. "Mr. You stated that you saw Mr. Ashe on the Ridge Road 2 weeks ago, on a Tuesday. Is that correct?" "That's right," Jed said, shifting uncomfortably under her direct gaze. "That is very interesting," Elara said, her voice calm and conversational. "Because on that Tuesday, from 9 in the morning until well after noon, Mr. Ashe was in my company. He was repairing a section of my fence that borders his property. I was with him the entire time. I served him lemonade at 11. My neighbor, Mr. Peterson, saw him there as he passed by on his way to town." She turned her gaze to the judge. "Mr. Ashe could not have been on the Ridge Road, Your Honor, because he was on my farm. This man is lying." The simple, factual alibi, delivered with unshakable confidence, sent a shock wave through the room. Jed's face went pale. Thorne's confident smile vanished. But Elara was not finished. "This false accusation is part of a pattern," she continued, her voice rising with passion. "It is what Alistair Thorne does. He uses lies and the law to take what he wants from people who cannot fight back." She held up a letter. "This is a letter from a woman named Clara Robeson, a widow like me. She wrote it 15 years ago, After Mr. Thorne stole her farm using fraudulent documents, she began to read the letter, her voice ringing with the pain and injustice of another woman, another time. Thorne's face was a mask of cold fury. His lawyer was on his feet again, shouting objections, but Judge Miller silenced him with a wave of his hand, his eyes never leaving Elara. When she finished the letter, the church was utterly silent. The story was too familiar. Too many people in the room had heard whispers of it for years. Mrs. Robeson was not the only one, Elara said, her voice dropping to a powerful, resonant tone. She turned and looked at the family sitting behind her. Mrs. Abernathy. Hesitantly, Sarah Abernathy stood up. In a trembling voice, she told her family's story, the story of their lost farm. Then Mr. Snyder stood. Then Mrs. Garza. One by one, the silent victims of the valley found their voice. They spoke the truth, simple and unadorned, and the collective weight of their stories was overwhelming. The narrative Thorne had controlled for 15 years crumbled into dust in a matter of minutes. When the last of them had spoken, Judge Miller held up a hand for silence. He looked at the stack of documents on his table, the copies Elara had sent him. Mr. Thorne, the judge said, his voice like chipping ice. The evidence sent to me by Mrs. Vance and Mr. Ashe was compelling. But this testimony is damning. He picked up a document. What is also damning is that this evidence corroborates a federal inquiry into your land dealings that has been underway for the last 6 months. Alastair Thorne's face collapsed. The blood drained from it, leaving behind a gray, papery mask of ruin. It was over. Not just this hearing, but everything. He made a move to stand, to flee, but the local sheriff, his face grim, stepped forward and placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. The quiet tyrant of the valley had been publicly and completely vanquished, not by a man with a gun, but by a quiet widow with a letter and the chorus of truth she had finally unleashed. The church slowly emptied, the townsfolk leaving in stunned, buzzing groups, the entire social landscape of the valley irrevocably altered. Soon, only Elara and William remained, sitting at their table in the now vast silence of the empty building. The afternoon light streamed through the stained glass windows, painting patterns of color on the wooden floor. The air, which had been thick with tension and animosity, was now still and clear. The threat that had shadowed them for weeks, and had shadowed William for 15 years, was gone. They didn't speak for a long time. There were no words for the enormity of what had just happened. William looked at Elara, at her profile illuminated by the colored light. She looked tired, but a profound peace had settled over her features. He was overcome with a feeling so immense it was almost painful. It was not just gratitude. It was all. He had set out to protect her, to shield her from his world, and in the end, she had been the one to save him, to save them all. She had faced down the dragon he had been running from his entire adult life, and she had done it with nothing more than her own quiet courage and the truth. He had seen her as someone to be protected, when all along, she had been a warrior waiting for a war. Finally, he found his voice. It was quiet, stripped of everything but a raw, vulnerable sincerity. He didn't say, "Thank you," the words were too small. He didn't say, "I love you," the words, he felt, he hadn't yet earned the right to say. Instead, he said the truest thing he knew. "I spent so many years being afraid," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "Afraid of my past catching up to me. Afraid of Thorne. Afraid of what people would think of me." He paused, turning to face her fully. "When I realized who you were, I was afraid you would hate me. In this church, today, I was afraid of losing my freedom, my name." He reached across the small space between them, but stopped just short of touching her hand. "But all of those fears, they were nothing. They were just noise. The real thing, the only thing, you are the thing I am most afraid of losing, Elara." It was the ultimate confession. It was the laying down of his last defense, the admission of his deepest vulnerability. He was not a penitent wanderer anymore, or a quiet carpenter. He was a man who had found something more valuable than his own redemption, and he was terrified of it being taken away. Elara looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his face. She saw the truth of his words in his tired, honest, gray eyes. She thought of her demand for time, for space to think. She thought of the fortress she had built around her heart, the promise she had made to herself to never be this vulnerable again. And she realized, with a quiet, startling clarity, that the fortress had already fallen. It hadn't been stormed. Its doors had been opened from the inside. "You told me to take my time," he said, his voice barely a whisper, misinterpreting her silence as hesitation. "And I will give you all the time in the world. A lifetime of it, if that's what you need." She looked at him, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face, the first truly untroubled smile he had ever seen from her. It was like the sun breaking through the clouds. "I think," she said softly, "I've had enough time." And she closed the small distance between them, her fingers lacing through his. His hand was warm, strong, and real. It felt like coming home. 3 months passed. The autumn gave way to the first snows of winter, blanketing the valley in a clean, quiet white. The fallout from the hearing had been swift and decisive. Alastair Thorne, facing a federal indictment and the complete collapse of his empire, had been ruined. His properties were seized, his reputation shattered. The legal process for the Abernethys, the Snyders, and the other families to reclaim their land had begun, a slow but steady march toward justice. The town, in its slow, cautious way, began to change its opinion of William Ashe. He was no longer the suspicious stranger, but the man who had stood with the widow Vance against Thorne. The story, embellished by Mrs. Gable into a grand romantic legend, became the accepted truth. Respect, hard-won, replaced suspicion. For Elara and William, the days settled into a new rhythm. He was a constant presence at her farm, his work and hers blending together seamlessly. He repaired the leaky roof on her barn, and she brought him hot stew for lunch. They worked side by side, often in the same comfortable silence that had first drawn them together. The quiet between them was no longer about caution or uncertainty. It was about a deep, abiding understanding that needed few words. Their relationship had unfolded in reverse. They had known each other's souls before they had known each other's names. They had become partners in a war before they had ever shared a proper meal. They were intimate strangers, building a new life together on the wreckage of their old ones. One cold evening, after a long day of work, Elara came into her warm kitchen to find a letter on the table. It was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. The handwriting was William's familiar, angular script. Her heart gave a little flutter. He had not written her a letter since the day she had discovered his identity. She unfolded it. It was not a long letter. "My dearest Elara," it began. "We have done everything backwards, you and I. We shared our secrets before we shared a conversation. We fought a battle together before we ever went on a walk. We built a partnership before we ever built a courtship. I wouldn't change any of it. But I find myself wanting to do things in the right order now. I want to choose you out loud, in the light of day, not just in the quiet of our own understanding. So I am asking, Mrs. Vance, may I have your permission to court you properly? May I call on you on Sunday? May I bring you flowers that are not a metaphor for a scarred past? May I walk with you and talk with you and earn the right to the future that I hope we can build together? Yours always, William." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or hurt. They were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. He understood. He understood that their beginning, born of secrets and shadows, needed to be brought into the light. He was offering her not just his love, but his respect. He was giving her back the courtship that their strange circumstances had stolen. She did not write a reply. A gesture like this deserved more than words on a page. She put on her warm cloak, pulled the hood up against the swirling snow, and walked out into the twilight. The world was hushed and white, the path between their two homes a faint track in the fresh snow. A light burned in his cabin window, a golden beacon in the blue dusk. He was on his porch, splitting kindling, as if he couldn't bear to sit still and wait. He looked up as she approached, his face anxious in the dim light. He stopped his work, the axe held loosely in his hand, as she walked up the steps. She didn't say anything at first. She simply reached into her pocket and pulled out his letter. She held it out to him. He looked from the letter to her face, his heart in his eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice soft but clear in the quiet evening. "Yes, you may." A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face, a smile of such profound relief and happiness that it took her breath away. He dropped the axe, the sound a dull thud in the snow, and reached for her. He did not kiss her. Instead, he took her cold hand in both of his, bringing it to his lips and pressing a warm, gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Come inside," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's cold out." He led her into the warm, bright cabin. It was the first time she had entered his home not as an ally in a secret war, but as a guest, as the woman he was choosing to love. He closed the door behind them, shutting out the cold and the snow, shutting out their separate pasts. They were finally in the same room, on the same side of the door, ready to begin. It was a love story, in the end, but one that had refused to follow the rules. It did not begin with a stolen glance across a crowded room or a sudden, breathless attraction. It began with a desperate act of courage, the choice to tell the truth to a faceless stranger in the dark. It was built on a foundation of shared loneliness, of two people reaching for each other across a void, not with their hands, but with their words. Their connection was forged in the quiet sanctuary of anonymous letters, a space where they were seen for who they truly were, stripped of the world's expectations and judgments. The miracle was not that they found each other in person, but that by some impossible grace, the person they found was the one they had been talking to all along. Their love was not solidified by whispered promises in the moonlight, but by the stark, terrifying choice to stand together when the world tried to tear them apart. The act of being seen was the beginning. The act of choosing to stand together in the light, that was everything.